Hey everybody, welcome to another edition of Anarchist, your home for anarchy on the internet, on over 160 radio stations in the U.S. and on satellite radio around the world via the Liberty Radio Network. We have a great guest coming on today, Judge Andrew Napolitano. He's the senior judicial analyst at Fox News, and he's just come out with a new book, Suicide Pact, The Radical Expansion of Presidential Powers and the Lethal Threat to American Liberty, which we'll play a promo for now. We'll have links to that down below, and we'll get into the book. But first, Judge Napolitano has once prodded at a Mises University event that he's an anarchist but doesn't know it. His response to cheers was, "Do you hear me denying anything?"
Sir.
I think you're an anarchist and you don't know it yet.
Do you hear me denying anything?
He's also been quoted when talking about being in a room with anarcho-capitalists like past Anarchist guests Tom Woods and Lew Rockwell, that he's the most libertarian person in the room. So, Judge Napolitano, just how libertarian are you?
Well, I suppose that it's a matter of degree, but I have a couple of first principles that I expect that you, Jeff, and most people watching and listening to us now would accept. And that is, first, that the individual is greater than the state. The individual has an immortal soul and free will. The state is merely an aggregation of people trying to live at somebody else's expense with a monopoly on force. Theoretically, it's here today and gone tomorrow. So the idea of balancing a right of an individual against the power of the state is anathema to me. The right of an individual is a natural existing right, and it would always trump the prerogatives of the state, except when the right of the individual is interfering with the right of someone else's, the exercise of someone else's natural right. I also adhere, of course, to the non-aggression principle, that the affirmative offensive use of aggression is always wrong. It is only valid in a defensive mechanism. That, of course, would remove almost everything that the state does from the state's armament. So with those two principles, the primacy of the individual and the inviolability of the non-aggression principle, follows just about everything else that I believe philosophically, politically, and economically.
That's great. And as we all know, the U.S., or as they say, America today, really has strayed very far from those sort of principles. Do you have any hopes for America in the long run, or even in the short run, in terms of getting back to any sort of principles of freedom?
Well, these principles that you and I are talking about, that I've attempted to articulate, of course, were embraced by almost all the founding fathers, and you can see them sprinkled throughout the Declaration of Independence and even in parts of the Constitution, particularly the Ninth Amendment to the Constitution, which basically says that there are other rights that people have that we couldn't possibly list here, and the government is prohibited from disparaging them. So not only must the government recognize natural rights, but the government can't disparage them. Unfortunately, the people in the government have a hole in their copy where the Second Amendment is, the Ninth Amendment, and the 10th Amendment. Another argument for another time. In the short run, to get to your question, there is hope if Rand Paul is elected president of the United States, and if people are elected in the Congress who agree with him. If Rand Paul were president today, with the Congress in the hands of big government Republicans as it is today, he'd be banging his head against a wall, and he could only govern by veto. But if Rand Paul were elected in 2016, and there were a lot of members of Congress who agree with him that were elected at the same time, we then could see a systematic dismantling of the extra constitutional parts of the government and a serious attempt to shrink the government down to the confines of the Constitution. Long term, I think that Jefferson was probably right. Long term, Jefferson argued that in the long run of history, government and power trumps individual liberty, and that's why periodically we have revolutions, because that's the only way to burst government's bubble, since it will never voluntarily divest itself of power. Sometimes these revolutions are peaceful, like I expect a revolution in November of 2016 to be, if Senator Paul is the Republican nominee for president. Sometimes these revolutions are not peaceful, like our own in 1776.
Yeah, it's always sort of struck me that it's interesting that the founding fathers created this system, which they said pretty much every 10 or 20 years you have to get into a bloody battle to get rid of the government. It's like, well, why even have it in the first place? But before we get into a little bit more about that, let me ask you about Rand Paul, which you brought up. There's a big conversation going on in the libertarian community right now about, is he as libertarian as his father?
But to be an anarchist and assume responsibility for yourself, I think this is a great idea.
I know that you know him very well. He wrote the foreword to your book, Suicide Pact. What's your take on Rand Paul versus Ron Paul?
I think that Rand Paul is every bit as libertarian as his father. I think he has a way of expressing things so as to broaden his base. His father, as you know, ran for president as a libertarian. As the nominee of the Libertarian Party. He also ran for the Republican nomination for president twice. His father did not choose to broaden his appeal by broadening his base. Senator Paul has done that. Having said that, there are some things that he has said recently that cannot be defended from a libertarian point of view. Make no pretense about it. But I believe he has said those things in the heat of a Republican primary where his audience is primarily conservative Republican and not libertarian. But I am satisfied to the core of my being that if he were elected president, he would govern the same way his father would, with the same deep, profound fidelity to profound principles of liberty that you and I have, Jeff, and most people listening to us now have.
That's interesting because I actually said that I hope he's like every politician and he's lying on some things so he can get into office, and then he'll actually just not do those things, which he's actually lying about. According to you, he's sort of massaging the message to try to get the Republicans in more, but then when he gets in, he won't actually do a lot of these non-libertarian things. So that's a very interesting take. You're involved obviously in the judicial system. I know we don't have much time with you, so I just want to quickly get through these questions. Do you see any have you thought much about a non-governmental judicial system, about private courts and private natural law and how that could function?
Well, the concept of non-governmental judicial systems is actually very popular in certain parts of the country. I was a life tenured judge in New Jersey before I left the bench and came into television. And in my home state of New Jersey, which has a population of about 7.8 million people, the concept of private judging, these private judges are usually former full-time judges, such as me, is extremely popular. It's far more efficient and far less costly. And it just involves a contract. The two disputing sides both agree on who the private judge will be, and they both agree in writing to accept the private judge's ruling. And if the losing party does not comply with that contract, then the winning party has to go to a government court to sue to enforce that contract. But it usually doesn't happen that way. Usually there is either full or substantial compliance with the ruling of the private judge. I'm 100% in favor of it. It's the wave of the future. Look, this does not work for criminal cases, and it does not work for things like a slip and fall in a supermarket. But it works very well for very high-end technical disputes over copyright, patent, trademark issues. It also works for complex commercial disputes where there are thousands of pages of documents to be examined, and both sides agree on the intellectual honesty of one person rather than rolling the dice with 12 the jurors whose intellects might not be appropriately suited for the examination of a complex issue. So I'm all in favor of it. But if you're talking about replacing all government courts with private courts, that would take a sea change in people's thinking. That would take more than half the Congress and more than half the courts to be Rothbardians, and I don't see that happening in my lifetime.
Yeah, that's interesting. One more question before I get into the final question on your book. You worked with Glenn Beck, and you were pegged to take over his show at Fox before you were removed after a very libertarian rant on your final show there.
Does the government work for us, or do we work for the government? Tonight, what if the Constitution no longer applied? What if the whole purpose of the Constitution was to limit the government? What if Congress's enumerated powers in the Constitution no longer limited Congress, but were actually used as a justification to extend Congress's authority over every realm of human life? What if the president, meant to be an equal to Congress, has instead become a democratically elected, term-limited monarch? What if the president assumed that everything he did was legal just because he's the president? What if he could interrupt your regularly scheduled radio and TV programming for a special message from him? What if he could declare war on his own? What if he could read your emails and your texts without a search warrant? What if he could kill you without warning? What if Supreme Court justices no longer looked to the Constitution to determine the constitutionality of a law, but rather simply to what justices who preceded them thought about it? What if the rights and principles guaranteed in the Constitution have been so distorted in the past 200 years as to be unrecognizable by the founders? What if the 50 states were no longer sovereign entities, equals to each other, and parents of the federal government they voluntarily constituted? What if the states were mere provinces of a totally nationalized and fully centralized government? What if the Constitution was amended stealthily, not by constitutional amendments duly ratified by the states, but by the constant and persistent expansion of the federal government's role in our lives? What if the federal government decided if its own powers were proper and constitutional? What if the Constitution were no longer the supreme law of the land? What if you needed a license from the government to speak, to assemble, or to protest against the government? What if the government didn't like what you planned to say, and so it didn't give you the license? What if the right to keep and bear arms only applied to the government? What if posse comitatus, the federal law that prohibits our military from occupying our streets, were no longer in effect? What if the government considered the military an adequate dispenser of domestic law enforcement? What if cops looked and acted like troops and you couldn't distinguish the military from the police? What if you were not secure in your person, in your papers, and in your property? What if federal agents could write their own search warrants in defiance of the Constitution? What if the government could decide when you were and were not entitled to a jury trial? What if the government could take your property whenever it wanted? What if the government could continue prosecuting you until it got the verdict it wanted? What if the government could force you to testify against yourself simply by labeling you a domestic terrorist? What if the government could torture you until you said what the government wanted to hear? What if people running for president actually supported torture? What if the government tortured your children to get to you? What if government judges and government lawyers intimidated juries into convicting the innocent? What if the government could send you to your death and your innocence meant nothing so long as the government's procedures were followed? What if America's prison population, the largest in the world, was a cruel and unusual way for a country to be free? What if half the prison population never harmed anyone but themselves? What if the people had no rights except those the government chose to let them have? What if the states had no rights except to do as the federal government commanded? What if our elected officials didn't really live among us, but instead all had their hearts and homes in Washington, D.C.? What if the government could strip you of your rights because of where your mother was when you were born? What if the income tax was unconstitutional? What if the states were convinced to give up their representation in Congress? What if the government tried to ban you from using a substance in your body that is older than the government itself? What if voting didn't mean anything anymore because both political parties stand for big government? What if the government could write any law, regulate any behavior, and tax any event? The Constitution be damned. What if the government was the reason we don't have a Constitution anymore? What if you could love your country but hate what the government has done to it? What if sometimes to love your country you had to alter or abolish the government? What if Jefferson was right? What if that government is best which governs least? What if I'm right? What if the government is wrong? What if it is dangerous to be right when the government is wrong? What if it is better to perish fighting for freedom than to live as a slave? What if freedom's greatest hour of danger is now?
Glenn appears to have gotten more libertarian over time. Do you think there's more people becoming more libertarian over time? Are you seeing this sort of change happening?
I am seeing serious libertarian views enter the mainstream. I can remember saying things that were very Rothbardian, like the individual is greater than the state, like the non-aggression principle when, with respect to offensive use of force, has no exceptions to it. And that was considered harebrained and crazy and fanatical. Now it's discussed openly and mainstream. You know, in addition to my work at Fox, I'm also a professor of law at Brooklyn Law School, a very fine law school here in New York City, which draws students from all over the world. And these ideas are regularly discussed in a classroom, openly and with intellectual honesty. So Ron Paul himself, not Rand, but Ron, is largely responsible for the entry into the mainstream of serious, deep libertarian thought. He very wisely aimed his arguments at young people. There are far more people in their 20s and 30s who embrace these ideas than there are in their 60s and 70s. And of course, that's very hopeful for the future.
Absolutely. So final question, let's get to your book, Suicide Pact, The Radical Expansion of Presidential Powers and the Lethal Threat to American Liberty. Why don't you tell us a little bit about the book and where people can find it?
Well, you can get the book at Amazon.com or BarnesandNoble.com. It's still on bookshelves of small independent bookstores and even the large bookstore chains. The book is a history of presidential excess, of presidential lawmaking and presidential law breaking. The first half of the book traces the excesses of the presidencies from George Washington to Bill Clinton. The second half of the book concentrates heavily on George W. Bush and Barack Obama. So in the second half of the book, we examine all the executive orders of President George W. Bush and President Barack Obama, at least the ones we get our hands on, and compared them to the Constitution and to federal law, and found them, of course, and to Supreme Court interpretations of presidential power, and found them seriously wanting. But there's another culprit in the book, and it's also the Congress, because almost every time a president of the United States has gotten away with unlawful or unconstitutional behavior, it's because he has either stolen power from Congress when it was popular to do so, or bamboozled Congress and pulled a fast one on them, and Congress did nothing about it. Under our system, Congress holds the strings. 2/3 of Congress can do nearly anything it wants under the Constitution, but they're often afraid to check the president when he engages in excess, even when his excessive behavior takes power away from them. So when FDR, for example, in 1933 made it a crime to own gold and told people they had to sell gold to the government at $25 an ounce, even though the government was going to sell it to European banks for $35 an ounce. They actually started this process before they realized, wait a minute, under our Constitution, only the Congress can write laws. You can't declare something criminal and establish a mechanism for addressing the criminal behavior on your own. And he suddenly realized that, yeah, his advisors were right and had to go and get Congress to do it. Congress was so embarrassed that they just went ahead and enacted into law, basically word for word, the executive order that FDR had issued. One of hundreds of examples in the book of presidential excess. The most egregious ones are the recent ones, Jeff, because each president builds upon the unpunished unaltered behavior of his predecessors. And so the more modern presidents have more unconstitutional behavior to build on. So as horrible as was the presidency of George W. Bush, who lied us into unjust wars and who authorized torture, the presidency of Barack Obama is even worse. Barack Obama claims the power and has exercised this power to kill Americans because it is difficult to arrest them, and he has based in part the argument in favor of that on the unchecked behavior of George W. Bush and going all the way back to Abraham Lincoln. So when presidents get away with murder, figuratively and literally, and Congress does nothing about it, it's not only harmful at the time they do it, it's harmful for the future, because future presidents will take that behavior and use it to justify theirs. That's the book in a nutshell.
Yeah, absolutely. It's getting worse and worse, and I wonder if Hillary is going to get into be the next president with Michelle Obama running as her vice president. I think that'd be sort of the death knell for this system.
It would be the death knell for constitutional government as we've come to understand it, that's for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'd like to thank you for taking the time. I know you're very busy. For anyone who doesn't know him, check him out on Fox News. He's on there all the time. And check out his book, of course, Suicide Pact. We'll have the links to that down below. And if you're interested in anarchy, if this is new to you, if you're new to this sort of extreme libertarianism, which isn't that extreme, all we want is peace and for people to be individuals and to not be ruled by anyone or forced to do things they don't want to do. Check out our channel at Anarchist. And if you're watching this on YouTube, like, subscribe, share down below. That's how you can spread these messages. So I'd like to once again thank Judge Napolitano for being on with us.
I got to tell you, Jeff, I'm going to start watching Anarchist. When I first saw it, I thought it was a typo. I thought it was supposed to be kissed, and I kept correcting the spelling until my wonderful producer, who's seated right next to me, said, no, it's Anarchist. God bless you. You got a new fan.
Thank you. Yeah, when you type it into Google or YouTube a lot, you type Anarchist, it'll correct it to Anarchist. And so, yes. But it's actually we're getting so big now. We've got over 1 million views, and we've got over 200 episodes, and we're all over the place now. That actually, if you type it in now, it doesn't autocorrect it. So we're getting there. So I'd like to thank you once again for being on with us. And this is Anarchist, your home for anarchy on the internet. Peace, love, and anarchy.